And we're live. Well, it looks like Jinxy's not here. I'm not quite sure what's happened. So it looks like it's just you and I. Or you and us. You and whatever the plural is. So let me know if the audio is coming through. Excellent. Excellent. Right, well, Liana MC set the theme for today, because otherwise Jinxy would have done it, I guess. We're going to look at UV maps. So I've got the, this is the furniture sample file with the default cube, but this might actually be a good example to show how you can work with UV maps and images in relation to the objects that you are, the objects you are unwrapping. So, starting with the cube, fortunately this has a texture already assigned, which makes this easier. So the simplest, let me switch to, so I'm going to switch the layout of Blender to the UV editing layout, rather than normally what you can do for doing quick edits is just adjust the layout. So if you hold the mouse over the border between views, you get the double-headed arrow appearing. Just left-click drag, and that alters the border. But normally you can just select the UV image editor from the list, but we're not doing anything particularly. It's easier in this context to just switch the complete layout itself, which we have a set of options up here, and just select UV editing. And that switches the view to this. So on the right, we have the object that we are wanting to UV map or edit. And on the left, we have the UV image editor. Hey, Prim. And on the left, we have the UV image editor. And at the moment it's blank because there's nothing showing or nothing selected. So if we can do one or two things. We can switch to edit mode with the cube, and that should automatically just pop in the image that we've got assigned to the cube. I would hope you're not, Prim. Is that not or not? But with UV maps, the simplest form is just a reset. And this is what Liana was asking in the comments earlier. What does reset do? So this is our texture on the left, which is a, let me just switch the, and what we've got, if I select one of the sides, is a single face of the box mapped to one side, one section of the image. So if I rotate round to where number 3 is, there we go. So there's number 3. So if I select the UV in the editor and just move it, we can see what the UV is doing in relation to the texture and the cube. So what reset does is it does literally what it says on the tin. It resets the UV so mesh, UV unwrap, and reset. If you watch the left hand side here, actually what I can do is I'll move that up here so we can see the UV. So if you watch what that does when we reset, and then select reset, and it resets literally to occupy the entire space of the texture. So that's the texture space that we've got available. So that is then mapped one-to-one to the object or the face that's selected. What it does do, I've never understood why it actually does this. So you might notice that even though the cube is orientated a specific way, the UV map isn't. It doesn't follow the orientation of the face. I've never understood why it does that, but it does it. An easy fix for that is just to make sure you've got the UV selected, and then you can press the R key to rotate it. Hold Control key down, and that snaps. And then left click to set, and then you've just readjusted the UV. But that's what reset does. So if it did the same thing with... Oh, I have to adjust the view. This is the one thing that you need to watch out for using Blender in particular, is that when you switch the layout, the 3D view essentially resets itself, so you have to set up or re-establish some of the display properties. So we have to set the scale to 100, and the... where's the camera clip distance gone? That's the cursor. Display. Lines. Where's camera clip gone? Oh, there it is. We have to set the distance, because you might notice this bottom corner is clipped, and that's because the distance, yeah, it's the distance to the far clipping plane. So that's the distance from the camera into the distance. The horizon is set at a specific number. It's given a value. If that's too short, anything that's behind that distance will clip, and it'll do this. It'll disappear from the screen because it goes beyond the clipping distance. So for our IMVU stuff, we have to adjust that. And it has to be quite a high number so that we can then see everything else. Yeah, so T Stone asked, so when you reset, so when it resets, only the side you are actually working on. Essentially, yes. Most of the functions, I think this is the same for most 3D applications actually, it's not just Blender. So if you were doing this in 3D Studio Max or SketchUp or Hexagon, it'll do the same thing, that whatever it is that you're doing is generally only applied to the selected surfaces that you want changed. So when you're unwrapping, specifically in Blender, when you are unwrapping, the modifications that you make to the surface and the way that textures appear, I'll get rid of the tool shelf. is based specifically on the faces that you select. So if we select number 2, we can see that that's the UV for number 2. It's still in its original form because we haven't done anything to that. So with that face selected now, if we do unwrap and then reset, we'll get the same thing. And again, rotate. So it's all specific to your selections. It's selection based. But that would mean that if you were wanting to do UVs as if you wanted to keep your UVs as simple as possible in terms of you just want faces to be covered with a texture, the simplest way to do that is to select individual faces. Let me just switch to make this easier to see, because that doesn't look. Oh, that's why. And you also might have to disable this option at the bottom, and that basically stops when you make a selection. With that disabled, Blender will allow you to make a selection at the front and the back of the box. So it sometimes means that you are selecting faces at the back of the box instead of at the front. So enable that. That's why it was going a bit wonky, and that normally happens particularly when you're in texture mode, because you can actually see through the mesh. So yes, if you are, the simplest way to unwrap something is just to select the faces that you want unwrapped. So for example, if, as we've got these two faces already adjusted, if we shift right click both of those to select them as a group, this might not work because we've got seams on this box. But what you can do is make group selections, and then you can unwrap. But instead of using reset, because what that will do, so if we do mesh reset, it'll reset the textures and their mapping to the faces. So it literally just resets them regardless of your selection. So if you want more control, you have to use unwrap. And what that does is it tries to fit the selection that you've made into the space that's allotted by the image. And it will do a best guess at that. For formal shapes like this cube, the results are usually quite accurate, in the sense that if you look at the two faces, they occupy exactly the same amount of space. And again, it's selection based, and again the UVs are orientated oddly, so you have to correct that by selecting. We can either rotate, hold control to snap, that one's alright, and again we can do the same on the other side. So select those two faces, mesh, unwrap, unwrap, and it'll do the same thing. Let me just get rid of that one. Oops. So if you did the entire cube, or if you wanted to do the entire cube or object, whatever it is, if you select all the faces, if you reset, they'll all look the same. And again, the orientations are off, so again, you have to adjust those. But if you unwrap, it'll do its best to try and fit the UVs, or the UVs of each face within the bounds of the texture. And in this instance, it's a kind of a step. Looks like a set of steps. But for a cube, this does present as a minor issue in that the texture is gridded 4x4, but the unwrap is essentially 3x3. So if you do an entire object, you're more than likely going to find that you will have to adjust the UVs relative to the texture that you've got assigned to the object. And depending on what that adjustment is, you've got the R key for rotate, the G key for translate or move, and then the S key for scale. And we've also got an advantage that we can use the 3D, well, it's 2D cursor in this instance, because the 3D cursor is that spot that's where the widget is, and there's an equivalent for the UV image editor, and we can use this to our advantage. If you press the full stop key or period key, what that does is it uses the cursor as a pivot point. So if we then do scale, it uses that point as the center of the action. So instead of doing as you would normally, it scales centrally. We can use that to our advantage in the scale relative to that fixed point which is in the corner, and we can adjust that in properties. So if you press the N key in the same way that you can press the N key over the 3D view and you get that panel, the UV image editor has its own that's selected vertex. Where's the cursor gone? Oh, there it is. So we've got a cursor location settings or properties, and we can set that to any particular value. 0, 0 is bottom left corner, and we can use that as a fixed reference point for making adjustments to the UVs. So if you hold Control key down or Control Shift to get smaller increments, and then we can adjust the UVs quite simply so that they fit the texture. Yes, so Liana is asking, on my water trough, would it have been best and most efficient to select faces I wanted unwrapped together, or by marking themes and then unwrapping? So let's put this into practice now that seeing as she's asked that. So let's make a simple water trough. Go back into the 3D view. Extend that. So select those two sides, and we can scale them. We can either use the scale widget, left click drag, hold control to snap, select the top, and still using the scale widget, but the pivot point is still focused on the cursor. So we can press the comma key and that'll switch to the selected. In the 3D view, that's this menu option here, pivot point. And at the moment it's active, or it should be active element. So let's expand that outwards that way and outwards slightly that way. Which bit? Do which bit against Frenzy? Ooh, the center point pivot for the UV map, I think it was, Jazz. Oh right, okay, so well, the center point for the selection in the 3D view, so that's this option down at the bottom here. Pivot point. And what this does is it changes the, if you make more than one selection, it's usually easier to see this if you make more than one selection. So there are two faces selected, and Blender needs to know what the pivot point is for whatever manipulation you're about to do. Do you want the face itself to be manipulated relative to it as an individual face, in which case the pivot point would be here, or do you want the modification you're about to make, do you want that relative to the group selection, which means that the pivot point will likely be somewhere in the middle. But using the pivot point selector, you can change how that behavior operates or functions when you do whatever it is that you're doing. So the active element is the last thing that you selected when you make a group selection. Whether it's a single element or a group selection, it'll be the last thing that you had selected. And you'll note that each time a selection is made in the 3D view, the widget, that's the blue, green and red thing, the widget changes its position. So deselecting those, it'll remain, well, it remains where it is when you deselect the last object that you deselected, but it'll still, so you might have to reselect something to refocus. Medium point, that is literally just what it says, medium point. So it's an average, it's positioned averaged relative to the selection that you've made. And again, it adjusts itself relative to those selections. So as you can see, the widget changes its position as you alter the selection. And individual origins, this won't be shown in terms of what the widget's doing, but if you manipulate the selections, what it does is it manipulates the, it performs the function relative to the individual faces that are selected as part of the group. And then we've got 3D cursor, which was the one we used before, which uses the cursor, which is that, well, we can't actually zoom close to it because it's always fixed size, but it's that red and white. Let me just select one of the other ones. It's that red and white circle or target thing, I guess you could call that. That's the 3D cursor in the 3D view. Oh, and then of course there's the bounding box, which we just switched to, which is the area. This might be easier to visualize, switching to that. So this, we've got two outlines. One is the would-be trough that we're making, and the other one, which looks like a rectangle lozenge, that's the bounding box. That's the area, the amount of space that the object is taking up. And that doesn't necessarily relate to the shape of the object that you are modeling. So if you select bounding box, you might find that the pivot point is somewhere over here on the right hand side, depending on the shape of the object. So just reading the comments there, the UV image editor has a similar option, but it's limited because it's only operates in a 2D plane. So there's only X and Y. There's no Z or Z axis, but it does the same thing. So when you're in edit mode, the cursor is by default in this bottom left corner, but you can change the pivot, which basically changes the behavior of the UVs. So in that bottom corner, they do that. Individual origins, they'll expand based on, well, you can't see it per se in the... There is a way to enable them so that you can see them, but if you imagine that there's a spot in the same way there is in the 3D view, we have these little orange highlights when the face is selected, or the little black dots when they're not. The UVs have a virtual version of that, so when you change the pivot point, they expand relative to that center point when you have individual origins selected. And then again, median point. And you might see or might notice, whoops, that when you initiate something, the cursor changes and you get a little dotted line. I don't know if this is coming through because it's quite small, but there's a small dotted line that's connected to the pivot point, and that gives you an indicator as to where the pivot point actually is. So that one was median point, and then you've got bounding box, which kind of operates a bit like the median point. Yeah, so as Liana said in answer to Frenzy saying marking seams is like cutting out one's object to make it flat. Yeah, a person highlights an edge, it's on the left side under the shading UVs tab. I think it will show it, I hope. Yes, I will show it. So back to the trough. Do a little bit of extruding. Oh no, we can do an inset with this. So press the I key, or it's not extrude. There we go. So it's in faces, inset. And what that does is it basically creates a frame. And you can either use your mouse or if you look at the bottom left side, you'll see a lot of text that's appeared. And there's a numerical value called thickness that's changing as the mouse is moved. You can type a number if you want precision, and then just press the enter key to confirm. And that creates a little inset. And then what we can do then, switch to the translate widget, is we can extrude down. Where's the extrude gone? Extrude, so extrude region, which is the E key. And then just pull down. And obviously we want to scale that. So we can either use the widget, or if we want to scale uniformly, because it's essentially the same on all four sides, just press the S key and just bring it inwards, and then left click. And that's our simple trough. But for the sake of UV editing, let me clear all the ones that are already on here. Clear seams. Right, so this is our simple object. And there are a couple of ways that this can be unwrapped or UV mapped. And how you do that, well, not so much how, but how you do it relates to what your texture looks like. Because, as Liana quite rightly said in the comments, if you imagine UV unwrapping, that is, what you're doing is essentially unwrapping the object as if it were a box being laid out flat. That's the unwrapping aspect of it. And then the mapping aspect is assigning the texture to that UV map that you've created. So it's a two-step process: UV unwrapping and then UV mapping. So I wonder if, let me just move this to another layer so that we've got a clean shot of, so that was the M key, M for Marty. It brings up the layer manager, and you can click one of these and it'll move the object to, well, whatever was selected, to the layer that you click on. So what might be better here is to do this. So I'm going to copy this. So the object already has an image mapped to the UV, but what we can do here is show how the UV, the way that you unwrap the UV, affects the way the texture appears on the object. So if we use seams, oh no, let's start with the basics actually. So what we can do, as we were talking about unwrapping based on face selection, so let's switch again to the UV editor. So which way around are we? Alright, so the top one, we're going to map this based on face selection only. So what we can do initially is select the top. We select the top rim. So that's a unit of a selection unit, I should say. And as this is a simple UV, what we can then do is mouse, instead of using the menu option and reset, we can just move the mouse over the UV image editor and press the E key, E for Edward, and that'll unwrap the selection. So Francis just posted a link in chat. Yes, that is literally a box unwrapped. So the photograph that she's... let me just see if I can move to a new window. Whoops. So yes, that is literally what unwrapping is. So that would have been a box. And unwrapping is essentially just flattening out the shape in order for you to be able to, because you've got to imagine that you're trying to, it is literally like gift wrapping, I suppose, to keep it seasonal. The gift wrap is just a 2D flat piece of paper. So in order to get that wrapped around the box, you've either got to change the shape of the paper or change the shape of the box. For UV unwrapping, what we're doing is changing the shape of the box to match the flatness, the flat plane of the piece of paper, rather than the other way around. But that is essentially all UV unwrapping is just altering the shape of the box as it's represented by the individual faces so that it can be laid flat on a 2D surface, which is the texture. So continuing on, and in fact actually what we could have done, and this is where it comes in handy to, when you look at your objects, what we could have done here is selected that bottom face, because it's almost like a planar projection. So we're looking down from the top of the object, and we can select surfaces that are essentially like for like. They're all on the sort of the plane that you're looking at. So for us, looking at this, we can select the rim. We can select the rim of the trough and the bottom face of the trough, and we can map that in one action. And then of course we've got to move that into there. And you just continue on around the object. But to make it quicker, instead of selecting individual faces and unwrapping them, what you can do is select opposite. So you're selecting a group. So that face, that face, that face, and that face. Because these are not connected, this will give us unique surfaces in the UV. So if we move the mouse over the UV editor, press the E key again, and that creates a set of UVs. And we just do the same for the inside. And unwrap those. Mouse over the UV editor, press the E key. Of course, you then have to do all the editing and tidying up, depending on what your texture is, to make sure that the UVs align. So that might mean going back over the selections and adjusting the size of some of the elements so they match approximately the UV. So that's one way. That's the simple way of doing it. It can be a bit more fiddly, but not much more, depending on the simplicity of the object. So that's UV unwrapping using face selection only. So to have more control over the way the object unwraps, we can use these things called seams. And what these are essentially just edge markers. So we switch to edge selection mode, and we can select individual edges relative to how we might want to unwrap the object. Now, using seams is much more akin to, where's that box image gone? So opening this up again, so seams are essentially the edges. So just ignore the tabs on this box for the moment. Seams run along the edges, and you can control how the box is split based on the placement of the seams. So for example, these dotted lines that cross diagonally, these obviously for this box, those are fold markers, but if those were as seams, you would create a split in the UV, which would cause a split in the box. So marking these as seams would essentially split the box into sections. So you'd have this section, and then this bottom section on the left. And seams allows you to control that to a certain degree, depending on the shape of the box or the object that you're unwrapping. But that's what seams are. Seams are essentially these edges that are separated or allow the separation of the box. But they're versatile enough that, which is what we'll show. So what have we done? Right, so what we've done is selected the edges. We need to also consider that the bottom of this has to be mapped as well. But what we want to do here is keep the object as uniform as possible in terms of it being a single UV. And we can do that by doing a partial edge selection, and we'll leave one edge unmarked because that'll still remain joined to the other section. And this should, so what we've actually got is the bottom of the trough is essentially the center of the UV. So if we mark these edges, mesh, edges, mark seam, the edges have now got, so if I deselect that, the edges have now got these orange highlights. So if we now unwrap the entire thing, so watch the left hand side, this has to be done with unwrap, so mesh, UV map, unwrap, and we get a flat. Let me just move that over to the workspace so it's easy to see. So that's the UV map that results from that. So Friends is asked, how do you make the UV map texture? Is that unique? Oh, you mean, right, okay. So what she's asking is, now if this were a derivable object and you were making this available for other people to derive from, you'd want to save this. So let me just move that back. So that layout is your texture map. But actually, before we talk about that, this is how versatile seams are. So what you can do is tab. So I'm going to do this quickly. So unwrap that. Just move that into the workspace so that we can see it better. So this is how versatile UV, right, so there we go. This is how versatile seams are. So we've got two objects that are UV mapped using seams. This is the result from one. So each of the elements, the main elements of the cube, or the box, the trough I should say, are individual sections. But the other one is more uniform or unified. Now, whether you use one or the other will depend obviously on the object itself and the size of your texture. But if you look carefully at the layout of this particular iteration of the UV map, you might notice that there's a lot of space essentially being wasted. It's not being used. Now, if this were a more complicated trough and there were fittings and fixtures, those fittings and fixtures could be mapped to occupy these small unused areas. But if the trough were just the trough as it stands, this isn't a particularly efficient way of using the texture because it has a lot of space unused. So this is where playing with the UVs is a good idea, because you can reduce the amount of wasted space by changing the way the UVs are unwrapped. And what that means is, let's look closely at this. So if I move this back over the space, now this might not be immediately noticeable, but the grid as it appears on the trough that we're editing, which is this one at the front, is denser it occupies more texture space than the one above it. This one. And that literally means that there is more texture mapped per selection or section of the UV for this one, for the bottom one, than there is for the one above. So that's another thing that you want to consider when you're unwrapping your objects. So you've got a few things to keep in mind. You can do really simple unwrapping, which doesn't particularly care too much about the placement of the UVs. This is usually useful when you have a tiling texture, which this is. Your only consideration really would be making sure that the tiled elements align up to some degree. Which bit's that from? Oh, it's on the inside. Is it? Yeah, it's on the inside. So let's select, where's the... Right, so if you do things individually, you just have to make sure that your tiling is approximate. And this is useful for simple objects with a tiling texture with a simple pattern. For the other two, these are for more unique objects where you are painting a texture specifically for the object. Because you have to, with this being, let's say it's wood, a wooden trough, you would have to orientate the grain of the wood relative to the orientation of the UVs. So you have horizontal for these larger sections and vertical for the smaller ones. So you would be making a unique UV map for this particular object, and you would be doing the same for this one. Although it might be possible to get away with horizontal grain in your wood texture because of the orientation of the UVs. Right, so Frenzy says she likes the middle one better. Now, if you are making this object for yourself, you're just making it doesn't really matter what the UVs do. If you're making the object to be derivable, then you've got a different set of considerations. Now, looking at the object that we've got selected, now which way is the right way up? So let me just select that one. Right, so if you're making these to be derivable, you have to keep in mind keeping things simple for the person that's deriving the object. Now, looking at these UVs, these two are upside down. Yeah, I'll be going over that in a second, Frenzy, exporting the maps. We'll get to that because that's kind of the last bit. Because these things, these other elements, or these other considerations you need to keep in mind if you're making maps for other people to use. these two selected items are upside down, so they will need to be flipped upright. So we can do that using mirror, which is Control M, and then the Y key. Press Enter. We'll just have to reposition them. What this means is that all the UVs are all orientated the same way, which basically makes it easier for people that are driving to just create their wood texture and not have to worry about, let's say they put some writing or there's a pattern somewhere on the texture. If you don't address these particular issues, the pattern appears, or the text appears upside down, which means that they then have to go back into their texture to invert the section of the map that they were working on to make it appear correctly on the object. So keep that in mind, that when you are unwrapping, you make sure that your UVs are all uniformly pointing in the same direction. For a map like this, there isn't a way around that because of the way that the object is just mapped. So that is something that you're going to have to decide whether it's not so much difficult, but it makes the process a bit more complicated, because the person that's doing the texturing then has to orient the section of the texture that they're working on relative to the UV map. So you couldn't just lay out a wood texture on this and have it appear correct on the object, because the grain, the horizontal grain, doesn't account for these vertical elements relative to the UV map. So they will have to do some editing. So that's one, I wouldn't say disadvantage, but that's a consequence of unwrapping this way as opposed to unwrapping this way. But once you've got all your UVs sorted out, what you can then do, and this is where the, let me just see if this fits in all of the, no it doesn't. So what we can do is select these two faces that are minor visible elements, and we can shrink those so they fit within the space that we've got. And we can do that because these are literally minor elements that are not going to be as visible to the user. So we can shrink those so that we keep the texture density, which is the amount of space each of the UVs uses of the texture. Whoops. But we have a layout that we can then shift that across. But once you've got your layout, what you can then do is from the UVs menu, export UV layout. Click that and you'll get your standard file browser, all UVs. We only have PNG really that we can work with, so make sure PNG is selected. Give it a name. And just click save. And that, have I got it? No, hang on. So I'll have to open my photo image editor. Frenzy, the green lines don't match up is irking me so much. Well, this is the thing with the UV map. When you're editing your maps, you try and align your UVs as best as possible so that they do line up. So where did this go? got to find it now. Oh, there it is. So that is your UV map. Great background. That's the UV map that you provide for other people. So that's the UV map for the trough that we've got selected. So for the middle one, let's shift that back down into there. If we export the UV map for that, UVs, export layout, again PNG, all UVs, and we can change the size of the image if we want, but that's really just going to be a help for texture artists to have a larger map, but you need to remind them that the texture or the actual size will be 256 by 256. So we export that, and that one looks like that. Create background. And then the third one will be a bit of a mess, but we'll do it anyway. So let me just do that again. So reset. Mesh. Unwrap. So why is it not doing that? Oh well, it's not behaving for some reason. So that's going to be a bit of a mess. So let's just save that anyway. That's T3. And that is going to look like that. See if I can, is it arrange tile vertically? So that, and that. So those are your three options in terms of how you can unwrap things and the resulting maps that it produces. But as we were saying in the when looking at Blender, you can see how much space is being wasted in this one. All of this is usable space, and it's wasted. Whereas with this one, we've got that and maybe these, which you could probably get some fixtures and fittings in these small spaces. And this one, well, you're not really going to wasted space isn't going to be an issue with this particular layout, but if it were, and that's basically, I say basically, but that's UV mapping in not quite so much of a nutshell. And no, Frenzy, as far as I'm aware, Blender doesn't do HTML stuff, so you have to hand code all of that for the product page. So it's a bit, it can be a bit overwhelming, but hopefully that's made it a little clearer as to, because you're not really just unwrapping something. There's all sorts of other ancillary considerations to keep in mind as you unwrap the object. And if it's for yourself, it's usually relative to texture density, which is how clear or blurry a texture appears to be relative to the size of the UV map. I mean, if we look at it's going to there we go. Right, so this that roughly hewn yellow shape, copy paste, is the same as this, and you can see from doing that how much space is not being used by that section of the UV in this unwrap map versus this unwrap map. So Frenzy's asking, I want one of those trapezoid shapes to be covered, to cover a full texture map. How would I do that? Well, that's literally just doing the reset that we were talking about right at the very beginning. So you select your face, individual face, and then mesh, UV, reset, and watch what happens on the left hand side here to this UV that's selected. It does that, so it smushes the selected face as best it can to fit the entire size of the available texture, which means you're going to get texture distortion, because obviously two things: the face that you've selected isn't square and it's not uniform, so you're going to get some texture smushing. If you use reset, that will always happen. There is no way to get away from that. You can hide it to a certain degree. For example, if this were, so let's reset each of the sides. Yeah, let's reset those. So mesh, transform, UV, reset. So if you reset the entire box with something like this that has a wood texture, or might have a wood texture applied to it, the fact that it does this distortion and smushing might not be that noticeable, because you could hide it as a wonky bend or twist or distortion in the wood grain of the texture image that's assigned to the box. So it's not necessarily that it's not necessarily going to be a no-no, as you mentioned, Frenzy. It's a possibility conditional to the texture that you're using. So as you can see here, this is actually tiling, because each face is mapped 1-to-1 to the available texture, and because the mesh height is the same all the way around, whoops, it tiles. Now if this were a wood texture, you wouldn't notice that diagonal distortion so much, or in fact the smushing top to bottom, left to right. So you can get away with it in certain instances, but it is something that you need to be aware of. Otherwise you will have to, let's do it on the inside as well. Reset. And the bottom. Reset. And again, you could do it, you've got to be careful with, you can get away with it better with larger surfaces. If you do it on smaller, thinner surfaces, and this is what a lot of people actually do, you get a much more significant degree of distortion, and you want to avoid doing that as much as possible. You can do it fine to a certain degree, larger surfaces, but not with these smaller, thinner ones. The best things to do is be selective with your unwrapping. So with bits like this, you can hide the fact that you've done a reset on all the sides by doing a proper unwrap for those elements at the top that are more visible, so that it creates the illusion that the rest of the object might be properly mapped. And for an object like this, you might also notice that because there's actually a follow through, these two faces here, they're joined, but you might be able to trick the eye into thinking that they are part of the same map. So you might get a tile across that edge, or the texture appears to tile across that edge, which breaks the illusion that you've essentially got a poorly UV mapped object. Well, that's just a question of to add a spigot or a drain to the trough, you're best off making that as a separate object and then joining the two together. So let's say, for the sake of argument, we can so what do we want for this? A cylinder. So it's added it to the center of the scene, and we need the tool shelf so that we can see the properties. Reduce the number of polygons, 8, height, that's fine. Model it as a separate object. Where's the red hat? Oh, there it is. Shrink it down. Well, however big you need the thing to be. Edit mode. Select top face. And then do whatever shaping that you want to do to that. Unwrap it. And then just place it where you want it to be, and then join the two elements together. And what you can then do, again, this is where how you've unwrapped the object comes into play, because what you could then do is unwrap the object in this instance. It's very simple. Let's do a unwrap cylinder. which always does this for some reason. So we have to shrink that down from Y, and it's by quite a significant degree as well. Where's the... There we go. I don't know why it does that. But that is a seriously smushed up UV. Did we? Oh, we scaled the object. Whoops. Yeah, that's seriously smushed. So, but once you've got your object mapped, depending on the space you've got available in your UV, you would then, let's say for the sake of argument, whoops, you'd plonk that UV in the bottom corner, which is available for use. And that's where something like this pattern of unwrapping comes in handy, because you can then fill these spaces up with bits and pieces that you can use for other elements of the object. No, well, you can frenzy, you can add objects whilst you are in edit mode, but if you're doing a complicated shape, you're best off modeling the object as a separate object so that you have greater control over the individual element that you're actually creating. And then what you can do is, once you've done that, you just join the two together, and if you want to unwrap them together as a unit, you can do that. But yes, it's generally best to just create smaller, you know, for this trough, for example, that's your taps, spigots. I mean, if there's a horse, what do they call those things that you tie horses to, that you see in westerns? If you've got one of those in the scene that's associated with this trough, you can add that, and so you have one object or one item in IMVU that would be comprised of several elements that are all part of the same mesh and all part of the same UV map. And then yes, you can so if you had water in here, as Leon is saying, I created my water plane separately. Yes, because what you can then do is animate that, so you could have that moving to give the impression of just water, moving water, or you could animate it using morph keys or armature-based animation. So there are a lot of things that you can do, but the way that you do them does influence the way that you unwrap your initial object, and then what you then do with it if you add other objects to the item that you're going to export for IMVU. Not as Frenzy's asking. In SketchUp, you can make groups and or components. Can you do this here? Not in the same way. You can make groups, but they are they're more to do with scene organization rather than creating actual sub-elements. Blender doesn't work that way. There isn't, as far as I'm aware, groups are literally just organizational devices. But if you are, what you can do is keep your, if you wanted, you can keep each of the objects separate and export them to FBX as a group, and then that's exported to FBX as a unit that's comprised of several meshes, several submeshes, and FBX will handle that fine, and you'll be able to get those in. Parenting, Frenzy's asking about parenting, whether that works the same way as groups. You can use it that way, you can use parenting that way, but it's functionally not the same thing. Parenting is a way of creating a link or an association between objects without them needing to be physically connected together. Well, we've, I mean, are there any more UV related questions? Yeah, thanks, Frenzy. It's UVs, or UV unwrapping or UV mapping, is actually very straightforward to understand. What complicates it is the fact that, so we've got our simple trough, and we've got 3 different ways of unwrapping, or 3 different ways of achieving the same end, which is a texture appearing on the box or on the object. But we've got 3 different ways of doing that. There are more depending on how you want the thing to be cut up. So if I duplicate this middle one, because, for example, let me clear all of these UVs, these seams rather, clear seams, edge mode, mark seam, unwrap. See, that's a 4th way. So there are now 4 different ways of unwrapping the same object. So which one do you choose? That's the bottom, so that can go inside there. But again, you've got similar issues with the amount of space that's wasted. But you've got a texture assigned to the trough. And that's the issue with UV mapping. It's the principle is it's very simple, but the complicated bit is trying to determine which approach you use. Do you use individual faces? Do you do a simple seam-based unwrap that will give you a sort of a cruciform? Do you split the UVs into sections, or do you split them into elements, essentially? So you've got, what we've got here is a top and outside. So that's So what we've done essentially is we've split the outside from the inside. So which one do you choose? That's the difficulty. Or do you do it so that each side is its own element? So what we're essentially doing is treating this object like it was made from real pieces of wood. And these were bits of, these were the sides. Imagine this is just a solid piece. So you're treating the sides as individual sub-elements, or you treat the whole thing as just a cardboard box and uniformly flatten it out. So that's the difficulty. It's the principle is the same for each of these, and it is literally just unwrapping, but your decision on how you unwrap is determined by the shape of the object and the texture that you are assigning to it. Is there a way to snap? I'm not sure what you're asking there, Frenzy. Is there a way to snap a center on the UV map? What do you mean by that? You mean position the UV so it's centered on the within the texture space? If that's the case, I don't think you can do that automatically. But don't quote me on that. You have to do it manually. Well, thinking about it, no, I don't think you can, because for a unified UV map like this, that seems like a reasonable option. That's only because this is a unified UV map. That wouldn't work for this, because what you would end up happening is all of these would be placed or positioned in the center of the UV, and you don't specifically want that. Do all that. So I guess the answer to that question would be no. Not by default. Computer says no. So what the process is generally trying to do is fit the UVs that you've unwrapped within the amount of space that's available. So that each element, if it's split up like this, has a clearly defined area of the texture assigned to it. So I guess we're coming up to 2 hours now. I must apologise for Jinxy. I don't know what's happened. I've not had any messages from her, so I don't know if she's caught up with the holiday shenanigans somewhere. She can't blame it on the snow, that's for sure, not being from California. Unless she's scraped it from the inside of the freezer. I don't think she's near those, but don't quote me on that. That's the fires, the California fires. I don't think that's in her region. I've not had any messages, so yes, apparently they've been the worst for quite some time, those fires. But hopefully she will be available for what will be the last gift wrap session on Friday. What's today? Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Yep, so Friday, Saturday. So that's the last session that we'll have for the gift box contest entries. So if you have any specific questions about that, ask them or save them up for then, and we'll go over because we still haven't done any texture stuff for that yet. Well, aside from the snowflake one that Jinx did in a previous session. But I guess we shall call it a night for now, because my voice is getting a bit hoarse. And we shall see you on Friday. It's not about winning. I mean, this is one of those moments where the participation trophies come to mind. It's about the participation. Oh, and save your files. Save as. How do you spell trough? Who cares? Yeah, you're very welcome. All right, everybody. We shall see you on Friday. Bye for now.